Feynman said that physics is like sex. Sure, there may be some practical results, but that's not the reason why we do it. So I'd like to apply this to collaboration. Collaboration, when you're collaborating with really interesting people who have different ideas than you do, and you can bring something to the table too, that's like sex. There may be some practical results, but that isn't the reason why you do it. And when you get involved in collaborations like this, it becomes addictive enough that you have to find the time to do them. So I tithe my time so I can do these. So I'm going to tell some stories about how this sort of thing happened. So this is the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. You'll notice that it's an aerial photo. It turns out that there was a really clever guy named George Lawrence, who was kind of a kite boffin. And what he did was he had this string of 16 kites and lifting this modest 46-pound camera about 800 feet up. He only had a half mile of kite string. And he even was playing with an early Steadicam. He has a 8-pound weight hanging underneath that. And he would take pictures every day there was good weather after the earthquake. So a friend and I were looking through some of these pictures, and you start wondering, gee, this must be really expensive to go out and do this. And so you start thinking about how much does it cost to take a photo from a particular altitude. So I can take your picture here and it doesn't cost me anything. We can climb on top of the building, and that's pretty cheap too. We can get in an airplane if we're going somewhere and take pictures from 35,000 feet, and that's pretty cheap. But it gets spendy if you go beyond that. So we rephrase the question, how high can you take a picture for $500? So a little bit of back of the envelope stuff on a little bit of physics, and pretty soon you come to the conclusion that, gad, it's got to be a weather balloon. And we started thinking about things, and a few weeks went by and an email came in, and it said, I managed to score a dozen pink Barbie's First cameras for $10. Are you in? Well, you know, how can you not be in for something like that? So I'll get into that a little more, but I'm going to get into a story of how I kind of fell into this now, if the clicker works. Okay, this is where I grew up. This is north central Montana. You'll notice there aren't a lot of tall buildings. You'll also notice there's a heck of a lot of sky. At night, the sky can be just spectacular. And when I was about 11 or 12, I became addicted to astronomy and kind of went through all of the books in the library. And so my librarian, I was looking for more information. There just wasn't any available. The physicists would say the mean free path between people who could tell me something was long. So the librarian suggested something interesting. Use the internet of the day, which happened to be one of these. You write a question and you try and send it to a lot of professors. And I sent it to dozens of professors. A couple of them answered. One was a physicist and one was a cosmologist. And they sort of mentored me and taught me a lot of physics, a lot of astronomy, a lot of problem solving over the years. So I found myself scattering quarks 10 years later, and that led on to some things. And they both told me, you know, you've got to give back in some way, which isn't something I thought about till I was in grad school. And there I started thinking about, you know, the good and bad things about religion, and in particular this law of the tithing, which was kind of strange. You know, you give 10% of your money to something, and if you're rich, that's easy, and if you're poor, you might go hungry, so maybe it's not a good idea. So I started working on tithing my time. So I spent 4 hours a week doing soup kitchens, and it was just spectacularly boring. It just didn't work for me. So I took a more selfish approach and started working with some really clever, quirky friends back in graduate school. Hey, this was pretty good. This starts working. So afterwards, I ended up in Bell Laboratories, which at the time had a just remarkably diverse set of people. And I learned that if you get your work done and you're doing good work, and you manage to have a little extra time, you can show up on someone's project and add to it and have a lot of fun. So I was giving a talk on a machine that writes math for making integrated circuits. And one of the ways you use to test this is you write little diffraction gratings on it. If you've ever played with diffraction gratings, you hold them up to light and they split up the light like a prism. You get a nice spectrum. And so I was giving this talk, and the resident artist of Bell Laboratories, I didn't even know they had a resident artist, was in the audience. She comes up afterwards and says, "Can you help me draw in rainbows?" So it seemed interesting, so she had a little program called McPaint, and she drew with it. And wherever it had a little black dot, I wrote a little program that made this machine make a diffraction grating. And when you held the plate up to the light, imagine you saw what she drew in just rainbows. This was just magic to me. And so we kind of started, she mentored me and I mentored her in a few things, and she started me kind of off on a pathway to learning a little bit about art, which was hard work on her part. And then, he said as he pushes this, something really strange happened. You can see how fashionable I am. This is the height of my fashion. I'm not wearing tennis shoes. Somehow I found myself in with some people who were doing a fashion magazine. There weren't many of them. They couldn't really figure out Photoshop. They seemed like nice, fun people to work with. I knew a little bit about Photoshop. I learned a little bit about page layout. And somehow I became the digital art editor for that, on the condition that it was for free. I would go in on weekends and spend about a tithe of my time, 11 hours a week. Suki, my wife, would go in and photo shoots and all of this. It was just great fun. And we saw what a complex and convoluted and Byzantine industry this was. And it kind of, I mean, really Byzantine. I had worked with the audio folks, and I thought the music industry was strange. This one was interesting. So this created a thread, and I'm going to describe a few other threads that wind in with it. So what does this have to do with it? Well, they're wearing clothes. So roughly about the same time, there was a lunch conversation, and they were talking about the Army worried about uniforms not fitting. They were trying to figure out a way to make uniforms fit. And a friend of mine who I knew was really creative and really clever, really fun to play with, was going to be on it. So I know how to measure stuff, and so we helped design a laser scanner that would look at people's bodies and make a couple of 100,000 measurements and create a mathematical model of their body. And in theory, you could drive a machine which would automatically cut out the cloth and maybe make clothes that actually fit. Turned out that time was a little bit too early for that, but it was an interesting learning. And one of the fun things was they actually got a couple of 100,000 people from the military and measured them, and it was one of the largest measurements of how people are shaped. If you line up people, you saw the Gaussian curve, short people on this end, tall people on this end, just really, really dramatic. And also, when you start doing these crazy things, people start being your agents and introduce you to other people who you might work with. And so this is a very good friend, Colleen, who happens to be, as you can see, that's a very large bike. She's approximately tall, and she's from the very far end of that Gaussian curve. And when you're around someone like this, you notice that man-made stuff doesn't fit them very well. So she is kind of forced to fit herself into things rather than the other way around. This changes your way of thinking. And so we got involved in a lot of projects on how do you make kitchen things fit, how do you make bicycles fit. And you go back to clothing, and gee, maybe it makes sense to think about that too. But time has passed since all of that, and some of you are experts in social media and all of these things. What does design mean? Does it come from the top down, or does it come from the bottom up? How do you and I help design? What are the limits? All of this. How do you do a digital bespoke for all of these kind of things? When you're working with someone like this, you think about things like this. The trick is you have to go and play and actually try these things and do it with lots of multidisciplinary people because it turns out it's really hard. You just don't write about it. So I've left you hanging. I talked about this thing of taking a picture. This is the Earth from 88,200 feet. Turns out what we did, now if you were to do this now, you could do it much easier. This was 10 years ago. We hacked a GPS. There were these Barbie cameras, so there were these mouse traps that were set up to be kind of a shutter release. 8 cameras went up. There were little heaters on them, a little homemade radio transmitter to send back the coordinates and the temperature. And so we got about 3 pictures. And this is reasonable fun, your own space program for $500. So, you can go out and do these things yourself. I couldn't have done this on my own. You have to find the right kind of friends, and that's the whole trick. And so the neat thing is that, and they can't do it on their own either. That's kind of neat too. So you have to kind of collaborate. And so the whole message is go back and remember that the collaboration is like sex. There may be some useful results, but there may be other things, like you may spark someone's imagination. You show this to people and they, it kind of blows their mind. Or even better yet, maybe you'll find a dear friend. So that's it. Thank you.